welcome. I think we're going to wait just a minute or two to let people get situated, and then we're going to start. Oh, and there's the dog. So just just a minute or two, and make yourselves comfortable, and then we'll get started. Did anyone manage to make a cocktail for tonight? Hey. Hey.
Just water.
L'chaim. Well, if for afterwards, there's a special cocktail that's dedicated to tonight's talk, called "To Understand a Tree," and that's on our Instagram stories and also in the RSVP email. So feel free to check in later. It's very summary. So I think we're gonna start. Just make sure, first of all, everybody, that you're on mute, and then as we get to the Q&A portion of the evening, we will open it up to questions, especially if it's an intimate group. But I'm just gonna go ahead and start now. Welcome to the Center for Art and Wood's Woodshed. Tonight we have an incredibly special guest named Gina Siepel. My name is Nava Milliken, and I'm the Artistic Director for the Center for Art and Wood, and it's so great to see you all here tonight. It's so exciting to be talking about To Understand a Tree tonight, and to hear, I think this is the first discussion of this project that's already gotten underway. Is that right, Gina?
Yeah, other than a really wonderful group of class visits at Smith College, this is the first time I've really spoken publicly about the project, so thank you.
Excellent. So it's a first view. So I think everybody knows how the Zoom thing goes with us by now. It's being recorded, so mind your square. And if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat. And then, as I mentioned later on, after Gina finishes her talk, Katie and I will moderate and then probably just open it up to everybody for a discussion. Thank you for coming. And I'm gonna say a few words to introduce you to Gina. If you were not able to visit the center's exhibition last May, called Moving Images Matter, which was an international exhibition featuring works in video by artists who are typically materials-based or studio craft-based artists. And Gina was one of those featured artists, and we were so thrilled that Gina was able to come to Philly and do a video workshop for people in the Philadelphia area, and then so we're just thrilled to have you back today. It's really exciting. So Gina Siepel is an interdisciplinary artist and woodworker based in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Her work explores cultural understandings of nature, gender, and American history through the production of objects, installations, and collaborative experiments, in public spaces. Past exhibitions include showings at the De Cordova Museum, the Colby Museum of Art, Vox Populi Gallery here in Philly, the Center for Maine Contemporary Art, Marlborough College, Smith College, Flux Factory, and the Center for Art and Wood, as I mentioned. Gina has received funding from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Berkshire Taconic Foundation, and the Puffin Foundation, and has been an artist in residence at Skowhegan, Mildred's Lane, Sculpture Space, and Hugh among others. Gina holds a BFA from the School of Art and Design at SUNY Purchase in New York, and an MFA from the Maine College of Art. She studied woodworking at the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship in Maine. Additionally, Gina has worked extensively in the field of theatrical scenic design and construction, designing and building projects all over New York City and the Northeast. Gina currently teaches studio art at Mount Holyoke College and is a visiting artist at the Smith College McLeish Field Station. So with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Gina, who's going to talk to us about a tree that she's become very familiar with.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nava. Before I share my screen and start talking through some slides and video excerpts, I just want to say thank you to Nava, to you, also to the Center for Art and Wood. I really can't imagine a better venue to begin this conversation. So thanks for inviting me and for all of the great program that you guys have been doing over the last few months. It's been really fun to see. I also want to thank two really special people who are in the sort of Zoom room with us tonight. One, Michelle Wick is here, and this project would not be happening without Michelle Wick, who's the coordinator of Arts of Field at the McLeish Field Station at Smith College. The other person who's here that I want to especially give a shout out to is my amazing and brilliant collaborator, Kate Wellspring, who is a naturalist, a botanist, and one of the most creative people that I know. She's been working with me very closely on this project from the beginning. So, and thanks to many other collaborators and conversation partners, what I'm going to talk about tonight is in no way the work of one person. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and it's just going to take a second because I have to go through a couple of steps. All right, so can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Good. Okay, so I'm just gonna move things around a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna just play this little clip here as a kind of intro to the project here. What you're seeing here is at the site that you're about to learn more about. This is a black-capped chickadee in early April excavating a nest cavity. So I want to introduce this project by talking about spending time in the forest, which as a woodworker, I've been spending a lot more time in the forest over the last few years, and I've become just a lot more aware of wood in its kind of various states of existence out there, and really asking questions about where does something like woodworking, which is such a materially based practice, begin and end. The project I'm going to talk about is a work in process. It's a little unusual for me to talk about a work that's not finished or resolved, but I'm doing that with this project because the whole point of the project in many ways is to provoke questions about the relationship between a materially based practice and nature, the origin of the material itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my questions, some of the processes we've been engaged in, some fragments of conversations that I've been having, and images. So there'll be video and audio clips as well as images. So just make sure your audio is up for everybody out there. So moving on into, other kinds of material processes that I've been observing happening in the forest over the last few years. This is a lightning strike. I think this is a softwood tree, though I'm not entirely sure. And just spending a lot of time out there, just kind of noticing the similarities and differences between the way wood acts in the shop and in the studio and in finished objects versus how it acts as a really, really raw material in nature. So recognizing many characteristics and then noticing other differences. In the forest, of course, we're surrounded by decomposition. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting to me. When you work with wood, of course, you're always looking for it to be a stable material. You want it to be dry most of the time when you work with it. You want to try to reduce instability, you want to reduce change. And then when wood is out there decomposing, on the one hand, it's such a recognizable material. And on the other hand, it's soft, it's full of water, it's full of life, it's, crawling with insects and mosses and lichens and everything else. And it's completely unstable. It's just kind of melting into the forest. So just thinking about action and material, and does this constitute something like woodworking? This is really where the curiosity for this project kind of began. Conversely, is this nature? I've been working with wood for my entire adult life. I made my living for over 20 years as a carpenter and woodworker. I mostly built theater sets in New York. And I was always trying to figure out how we could do our work in a way that was more ecologically sound in terms of how we use materials. And this was a big issue for me. And as I kind of gained agency in my various professional aspects, I was able to find some interesting solutions to that problem, but I was kind of always bothered by the problem. This picture is an image I found on the internet of Rosenzweig Lumber in the Bronx, which is, any New York City woodworker knows this place. This is kind of like the place you go. They have wood from all over the world, all over the country. It's an amazing, amazing site for somebody who's interested in this material. But thinking about the forest and then thinking about sites like this led me to really think about all of the divisions in a complex, specialized, modern capitalist society, all of the divisions that happen between, you know, this or this, these trees in the forest, and this, and then the piece of furniture that, like right now, I'm standing in front of a wooden table. So you start with the tree, then you go to a forester, right, who selects the right trees for cutting. Then you go to a logger who cuts the trees. Then the trees go to a sawmill. Then they're dried in a kiln. Then they go through into some kind of dealer kind of infrastructure, like a lumber dealer or a lumber yard or that kind of space. Then they go to a manufacturer or a craftsperson. Possibly after that, they go to a retailer. And then finally, this tree might land in your home or my home. And by that point, it's pretty hard to envision it as a tree. So I wanted to try to kind of close that gap a little bit. The title of the project that I'm going to talk about is To Understand a Tree. And what it is essentially a small scale personal exploration of the forest by a woodworker. I wanted to ask really about what the effects are and what the impact is of taking a tree out of the forest, to kind of hold myself and my practice accountable in this particular way. And by way of exploring that, to ask, what is the community of the tree? What is the neighborhood of the tree? What is affected by this tree, either when it's alive in the forest or when it's been taken out? And then, is a woodworker part of the community of the tree? Just a few kind of facts about the project. The project started in 2018, but we got in full swing in 2019. It's being made in close collaboration with my dear friend Kate Wellspring, who is a naturalist and a botanist by training. It's happening at the Ada and Archibald MacLeish Field Station, hosted by an organization called Arts of Field at Smith College. The location of the site is in a town called Whately, Massachusetts, which is about a 20 or 25-minute drive from the larger city of Northampton. So the structure, I'm going to tell you like the structure of the project initially, the original idea, and of course things have kind of evolved and changed from there. The idea was to identify a single tree in the forest. And I wanted to work with a typical deciduous hardwood furniture grade tree. I wanted to spend time with this tree in its habitat and to try to come to some kind of greater understanding of it as a living organism. I wanted to kind of conduct this inquiry in a collaborative way, where I wasn't trying to do this all on my own, but I was actually really seeking the expertise and the viewpoints and the perspectives of a diverse group of other people. And I wanted to produce video documentation of this whole process in order to be able to sort of bring others along with me eventually and produce a kind of lasting document of the whole project. Ultimately, at some point, the idea originally is to harvest the tree, to cut the tree down. Upon cutting the tree down, I would then build a group of chairs with the tree, working toward an all-encompassing kind of installation exhibit in which all of the video documentation would be exhibited along with the chairs, which people would be invited to sit in, thus confronting and questioning their own relationship to this material, to this tree, to the site, etc. So that's the sort of original kind of seed. I'm going to try not to make too many botanical metaphors, but I might fall into them anyway. It's the original idea, and things have kind of just evolved from there. So fundamental questions. To what extent can I get to know a tree and its immediate neighborhood in the forest? And how will I do this? How will creating a relationship to a particular tree or forest site change my practice of woodworking? What if I considered its ecosystem of origin as intrinsic to the properties of a material, extending this kind of core modernist truth to materials concept? So I'm very interested in truth to materials as it came down to us through like John Ruskin and the Bauhaus, but it always seems to sort of only begin at the point of extraction from nature. And so I was wondering, like, what would happen if we thought of this more inclusively? Again, this is always meant to be a kind of collaborative set of questions. And with this first question, to what extent can I get to know a tree and how will I do this? The collaboration of people with background in the sciences, most principally Kate, has been really essential. I was essentially asking a question that, at least in that realm, I didn't know how to answer, and I have really benefited from help and guidance in that. I'm going to talk about a few inspirations to kind of flesh out the space of this. So inspirations coming from both art and ecology. This project is meant to really reside in between. I think, you know, art is inquiry, woodworking and design practice, and ecology and environmental questions. So it's an inherently kind of interdisciplinary project. So on the left, you see Peter Wolleben, who is a German forester. And on the right, Suzanne Simard, who's a forest ecologist in British Columbia in Western Canada. Both of these people have done extensive work on the idea of forest interconnection. So probably most people by now have sort of heard a lot of stories about this. There's gotten a lot of coverage on NPR and places like that. This idea of how trees communicate using these fungal mycelial networks, sending each other resources, larger trees supplying smaller trees with nutrients, with sugar, with water, trees sending signals to each other for danger, the ways that the tree and the fungus work together. The fungus absorbs nutrients from the soil that are needed for the tree gives sugar to the mushrooms. So this is sort of challenging conventional understandings of all of the trees in the forest as individualistic loners competing against each other for light. So it's, you know, we've learned through the work of people like these two people that those ideas are not the only thing that's happening. A different, but in some ways connected inspiration is this piece. This is a durational performance, collaboration by the artists Linda Montano and Teshing Xie. It was a one-year performance. It took place between 1983 and 1984. I'll just read the caption. This is from Teshing Xie's website. In this performance, Xie and Montano spent 1 year between July 4th, 1983 and July 4th, 1984, tied to each other with an 8-foot-long rope. They had to stay in the same room and were not allowed to touch each other until the end of the 1-year period. So I've had an ongoing fascination with this piece for a long time, and with both of these artists' work in general, especially Teshing Xie. I'm also really, really drawn to this idea of durational performance and this relationship of art as inquiry, using art practice as a means to ask and explore like really big open-ended questions. Especially in this piece, these themes of interconnection, exploring the relationship between self and other, and the kind of closeness and distance that they had to each other, that they were tied together with this rope, but they could not touch. So there was a kind of intimacy and yet also distance at the same time. The last inspiration I'm going to talk about is this quote from Martin Buber's I and Thou. Buber was an early 20th century philosopher. So I'm just going to read this. It's a little bit long, but he writes, "I consider a tree. I can look on it as a picture, a stiff column in a shock of light, or splash of green shot with the delicate blue and silver of the background. I can perceive it as movement, flowing veins on clinging, pressing pith, suck of the roots, breathing of the leaves, ceaseless commerce with earth and air, and the obscure growth itself. I can classify it as a species and study it as a type in its structure and mode of life. I can subdue its actual presence and form so sternly that I recognize it only as an expression of law, of the laws in accordance with which a constant opposition of forces is continually adjusted, or of those in accordance with which the component substances mingle and separate. I can dissipate it and perpetuate it in number, in pure numerical relation. In all this, the tree remains my object, occupies space and time, and has its nature and constitution. It can, however, also come about, if I have both will and grace, that in considering the tree, I become bound up in relation to it. The tree is now no longer it. I have been seized by the power of exclusiveness. So this quote was given to me by my partner, Sarah Smith, who's also here, as a kind of, in a way, like a perfect distillation of the question of this project. What does it mean to become in relation to something? Will the tree cease to be it, and will the tree become you? Is the essential question that I think he's asking here, and maybe that's definitely part of what I'm asking also. So I want to take a minute to just talk about place. Trees are, of course, they grow everywhere, different species, a huge variety of trees globally, but this tree is in a particular place. And this is a Google Earth slide from which I've removed all the national borders and roads and all of that to give a sense for the expansive forest that northeastern North America still is, even though it's been cut many times, the forest keeps coming back. The tree is kind of right on the boundary of a town called Conway and a town called Whately. These are in the homelands of the Pecumtuck, the Nipmuc people, and the Wabanaki Confederacy. This is a part of the country that was settled by Anglo-Americans pretty early in the 1600s, but it's been rural throughout that time. A little bit closer in, so you can see here, this dropped pin is, of course, the approximate location of the tree. We're in a pretty large area of forest. The property of the Smith College site is about 260 acres, but there's a large state forest and city watershed around there. So there's a lot of forested land. And other than that, it's a pretty typical central New England area with a mixture of farms and towns and roads. The forest community is essentially, could be characterized as northern hardwoods, hemlock, and white pine forest. The land use history includes, it was pasture at one time, it was all cut. It then, even as it grew back, it was cut selectively for firewood and other uses. And it was probably plowed and tilled in some areas. So part of what I love about the site that we're working at is that it's extremely typical for the Northeast. There's nothing exotic about this place. I can guarantee anybody who spent time in the Northeast has been at a site that's almost exactly like this. This is the site itself. You can see on the left-hand photo, there's a tree in the center. That's the tree that we're working with. And behind it, in the photo on the right, you can see that there's a vernal pool. So this is essentially our observation studio and laboratory. The size of the tree that we chose is about 24 inches in diameter at 4 feet off the ground. It's about 85 feet tall. And it's probably about 75 years old. The forest community around it is fairly diverse, but the understory is pretty sparse, which is apparently typical of former agricultural land. This vernal pool that you see there, the water rises and falls really regularly, and Kate and I are always texting each other about how much water is in the pool today. So it gives us a kind of a real sense for the changes that are constantly happening in the forest. I'm going to go through just a couple of different modes that we've been working in, because I think one of the things that's really interesting about this project is it's a project that's rooted in like really big questions and kind of broad curiosities. And it's also like really, really localized at the same time. And I think in the beginning that was a little bit overwhelming to me. It still is actually in many ways. But we had to kind of devise entry points. So I'm going to talk about some of these. Observation and research being the first one of them. So really empirical observation, both just in a more kind of scientific vein and also just in a more kind of artistic or kind of backyard naturalist vein, with some support from subject area specialists. Well, the first thing we did was we made a map of our site. So we defined a site that was, the tree is 85 feet tall. So we got a rope, we cut it at 85 feet, and we made a ring around the tree that was 85 feet in radius. So that was how we defined our working site. We spent a couple of days mapping all the major features of that site using ropes and tape measures, extremely primitive mapping devices. And that was a lot of fun and actually really hard work. And then that enabled the beginning of this biological survey, which has been a really principal contribution of Kate's to the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that first. Kate has been visiting the site regularly over the course of a full year. We've been out there for a year now, and surveying vascular plants, non-vascular plants, fungi and lichens, vertebrate animals, invertebrate animals, and we've both been surveying birds. So just getting a sense for the plant community and the diversity that's present there and the overall health of the ecosystem. So this is just a page from Kate's survey. It's a very dense document filled with many forms of life. Along with that, Kate has been collecting certain plant specimens and creating these pressed plants to allow us to have kind of physical documentation of some of what's growing there. So what you see in the center there are leaves from our tree that we're studying, the northern red oak tree. And one of the kind of great things about this is oak trees produce acorns irregularly in these cycles of overproduction, which is part of what allows more oak trees to grow. So they produce many more acorns certain years so that the acorns don't get eaten by all of the animals. So the animal populations can't just rise with the level of the acorn production. These are called mast years, and last year was a mast year. So Kate's actually been collecting acorns and raising seedlings at home from our tree, as well as the ground out there is now covered with seedlings from this oak tree because of this mast year. Evidence of non-human land-dwelling animals at the site. Kate's got a wildlife camera set up out there. So there's just, some of this is sign and some of these are actually directly observed animals. On the left, you see bear claws that are in the bark of this beech tree. In the center, there's a doe and a really small fawn that's probably hard to see on your screen to the right. A red eft, which is a juvenile eastern newt, a wood frog, a coyote captured on wildlife camera, the den of a rodent. So just in this one site, seeing so much life that's happening regularly. We've seen bear at the site, I think 3 or 4 times, skunks, squirrels, chipmunks, bobcats. There's evidence of all these animals on this site. Birds, again. I've cataloged over 30 species of birds just on this one, 180-foot diameter circle. Year-round species, migrant species, most exotic, probably with the Blackburnian warblers, the scarlet tanagers, and the indigo buntings. Most ubiquitous would be blue jays, chickadees, gray catbirds. The photograph on the lower right is interesting because we've been watching a pair of scarlet tanagers over the course of the spring and summer. And for anybody who knows them, they're this really brilliant red, incredibly beautiful, wonderful bird to see. You don't get to see them all the time. And there was a pair that's living at or very near the site. And then Kate discovered recently one day that predation had occurred and one of them was killed. And those are the feathers that are left, and they're right very close to the tree under a patch of mountain laurel. So a lot of stuff goes on out there when we're not at the tree. And I think for me, it's been interesting to think about that because in some ways, the more you know about nature, the more you react to things, at least for myself personally. that I don't just walk through the woods and think everything's fine. I now understand a lot more about what's happening, and on a lot of different levels. So challenges like just learning to identify all the different barks. These are some of the predominant tree species that are at the site. So I won't go through them all, but there's a predominance of hardwoods, birches, cherries, oaks, maples through the site. And it's been really amazing as an artist, and also from a naturalist perspective, to start to just really pay attention to all these things and to try to both visually understand and enjoy, and also analytically understand what's going on around us at the site. I want to talk a little bit about chairs also, like why chairs and trees. On the left is, these are two artists who both portrayed chairs in ways that I find really compelling. On the left is Vincent van Gogh's chair from 1888, oil on canvas. And I see this chair as a kind of portrait of Vincent. That's really how it was intended. And chairs are something that become kind of stand-ins for humans. They're portraits. They're really like, they're objects that we interact with in a really intimate way. And then on the right is Doris Salcedo. This installation is from the Istanbul Biennial in 2003. It contains approximately 1,550 wooden chairs stacked between two buildings. And it was meant to kind of metaphorically address the history of migration and displacement in Istanbul. So I kind of feel like this piece is playing on a lot of the same ideas as Vincent's chair. The chair is a metaphor for the person. The chair is a portrait. And, one of these is like, steeped in loss, and the other is a kind of, kind of like about presence, I think. I also put these together because I think this project has led me to think a lot about scale in general. Scale being a really critical concept to almost every question of environmental concern, climate change, forests, the scale and speed of evolution, and different species' ability to adapt to changes that are happening. So I think scale is just really critical to so much of what we're dealing with. As I researched chairs and I thought about the way they interact with our bodies, and I thought about the way they come from forests and how they're this kind of meeting point, I got interested in green woodworking. I wanted to work really closely with the material in a kind of intimate way, without a lot of intermediary processes like drying and kilns and sawmills and all of that. Red oak is a ring porous hardwood, which means it's well suited to splitting and riving, which is how you work in green woodwork. And so I've begun to kind of learn this tradition, starting with this sort of intimacy with the raw material. But it's also important to talk about the other reason I'm interested in this tradition is that it's so close to our colonial origins, which I think, we're in this kind of really wonderful and important moment of reckoning with that. Green woodworking, this kind of simple New England furniture. This chair on the left I found in a attic of a junk shop in rural Massachusetts. On the right, you see an image of a chair in process in a workshop that I took with Chris Nassis, who's a greenwood chair builder in Easton, Mass. How does furniture emerge from colonialism? What is the relationship and the intersections between colonization, deforestation, furniture production, forest pathogens, introduction of insects, fungi, and diseases to native species, the change in land management practices from native people, indigenous people in North America who were managing the forests for food production in many ways. And then European colonists came in and immediately started cutting timber for export because colonization was a capitalist project and Europe had already been deforested. That's a big part of what's going on. So I'm really trying to think about furniture in relation to those histories. So The next kind of mode is really conversation. So I'm gonna just kind of talk about a few people that we've been engaged with as a part of this process, and I'm gonna play a couple of clips, video and audio. So we, not only have Kate and I been working closely together as a part of this, but we've brought in other people from the local community that we know who have expertise that we're interested in learning from. This is Yoni Glogauer. He's a forester and naturalist. And Yoni was the first person who really challenged my assumption that removing a tree was always bad from the forest. And we talked a lot about the complexities of managing forests now to produce the forests that are desirable in the future. And so removing trees from the forest is actually very ambiguous in certain ways. You're letting more light in, you're creating conditions for new trees to grow, but you're also taking out a tree that's providing habitat for many other creatures and having a particular effect on the forest. We've also been talking about this project pretty regularly with students. So we've had class visits with a number of classes at Smith College. This is a couple of images from Alexis Callender's Drawing One class at Smith College, where we brought students out and did some observation exercises and some drawing exercises. And then these are some of the works that her students produced in response to our conversations and their experience at the site. There's been a series of these class visits with classes from psychology, classes from biology, classes from art and art history. So this is the first clip I'm gonna play. This is Tom Jenkins. His company name is Blue Dog Forestry. Tom is a practicing forester. He's focused on sustainable management of local forests in Western Mass. And we invited him out to look at our tree with us, and actually to look at a whole bunch of trees we selected as possible candidates for our project, and discuss the trees, their habitats, their potential as sources of wood. So I'm gonna play a clip here. It's about 2 minutes long.
It's definitely a nice tree, but I can still see signs of it. It's growing really fast. It's a good fast tree, fast growing tree, but you know, there's probably an old knot here and maybe another one up there, you know, another one just above my stick up there.
Point out how you're seeing that, because all I'm seeing is bark.
Just bark, yeah. It's just the little variations in the bark. This does have a pretty big canopy up there. It's casting a lot of shade. There is a vernal pool right there. So we could temporarily raise the temperature of that vernal pool. I don't know that it would be substantial or long lasting, but
that would happen just because of additional sunlight?
Just because of the sunlight, yeah.
Okay.
I would, you know, if I was marking this wood lot just to, you know, get a logger in here, I don't know if I would mark this tree or not. It's big enough. Interesting. You know, I used to always try and get our oaks to 24 inches and say 24 inches is financially mature. That's where we should take them. So this one's definitely 24. Yeah. As sawmills in our area have retooled and put in more modern machinery, they're geared up for smaller logs. And so now a 20-inch tree actually has more value than a 24. I think, you know, if I were, say you were just my typical client saying, you know, I want to do a timber harvest, I want to have good wildlife habitat, good aesthetics, you know, healthy forest, make some money off it. You know, as I came through this area, I might leave this tree actually. I'd probably pop out a couple of these pines and hemlocks and leave this for a little while and see if we can seed in some more oak and then cut it next time.
Got it. Okay. How much money is this tree worth? Roughly.
Standing up here on the stump like it is, probably $250.
Really? That's it?
Yep. Yep. They add up quicker if you're doing a real commercial timber harvest. You know, if there was a little more oaks in here, then, you know, we can say 250, 500, 750, 1,000. It adds up to a lot of money pretty quick, but you're just.
Oops. Okay. So another conversation partner on a kind of another plane entirely is Bob Leverett. Bob Leverett is a mathematician and an engineer. He's actually a retired Air Force engineer. He's an expert in the old growth forests of New England. He's a fascinating guy. He does this amazing research that I think there isn't a woodworker alive who wouldn't fall in love with what Bob Leverett does. What he does is he measures trees, living standing trees, really, really large ones, 400 feet tall, trees like that. No, sorry, 200 feet tall, 400 years old. And he's able to, through analyzing them geometrically in an incredibly rigorous way, he's able to calculate the volume of the tree as an organic form. And then because he understands the volume of the tree, he's able to calculate how much carbon they sequester. So this, has to do with their impact on climate change, and what their rate of carbon sequestration is. And so we were actually set to have him measure our tree in April, but then the pandemic kind of threw off our timeline. But he's going to measure our tree, and he's going to be able to tell us what is the relationship of the amount of carbon that our tree takes in from the atmosphere and holds sequestered as wood. This research has had a lot of implications for forestry. It's challenged accepted practices of conventional forestry, which kind of say that younger trees are more important to forest and climate health than older ones. So it's fine to cut all the big old trees and let the younger ones grow. And Bob's research, I won't go into all the details because it's really complicated, but his research really challenges that. So it's been really amazing to kind of learn from him about that. One last clip regarding conversation. This is from Joe Kent Katz, who is an intuitive healer. And we wanted to kind of balance out bias towards scientific ways of knowing that has kind of, most of the people we've encountered and have been interacting with are kind of science or, foresters, those kinds of bases in their work. And so Joe is, I'll use her words, I receive information from the unseen world, including ancestors and plants, for the sake of individual and collective healing. So Joe is able to communicate with trees in a very particular way. So Joe came out with me to the forest, and we had a session just a couple weeks ago where she was able to kind of tell me communications that she was receiving. So I'm just gonna play a short clip, about 2 minutes, from Joe. I should also say I've paired this with the Charles Birchfield Nocturne painting, because humans have always found access to visionary experiences in forests and with trees. And I really love these kind of early modernist nocturnes that kind of push at that just a little bit. The audio in the beginning is a little rough, but it gets better.
Has connections, very strong connections to 3 trees of its species that are right. One's that way, one's in front of me, and one's to my right, and one's way far back to my left, but way, way that way. This tree is deeply connected to a tree in like a northern Georgia, like near the northeast corner of Georgia, not right in the corner, but close. There's a tree there of not the same species. And this tree is supporting that tree, and that tree is supporting this tree. So,
Can I ask a question? Those trees that those trees connected to, are they of a similar age to this tree?
yeah, very much so. But I'm laughing because it's like a silly question to them, because the ages of this, what it looks like, Gina, is that like this tree is cut down, but before that the like energy that was this tree was already there. So like it had a different form, and this could be cut down and it's still there. So the relationship exists. It's like it actually is like that with humans, but we're not planted, so we don't know that.
So this was a really interesting day for me to be in a familiar site with this tree that I'd learned quite a bit about, and to hear it reflected back from an entirely different viewpoint, it really, it brought up quite a lot and made me think about a lot of different things. Kind of segueing from that, the last mode that I want to talk a little bit about is just contemplation, in addition to observation and conversation. So this is probably the most personal and kind of the most artistic aspect for me. And it's really rooted in a desire and a choice to, it's very natural for me, I think, to apply a lot of analytic frameworks to this question, especially working in an organization where there's a lot of science people around and working in collaboration with a scientist. And to try to say like, okay, that's amazing, and information is, you know, transformative, but information is actually not the entire answer to the question. So this contemplation part is really about just being there, spending time, being present, noticing everything that I can. We've put up this hunter's tree stand next to the tree, so spending a lot of time in the tree stand, just observing the forest around. And I've been creating video that kind of reflects this state. I thinking a lot about time in relation to a tree. A tree's experience of time is so different from my own as a mobile creature with a shorter lifespan. So this quote is from Stanley Cavell's book, Senses of Walden. He's talking about Thoreau's experiment at Walden. He says, one earns one's life in spending it, only so does one save it. So really the principal currency of life being time. Some of the sort of contemplative experiments I've been taking on are these little performance scores. So trying to really think about the senses. This one is, I've been just doing these kinds of little experiments. Set a timer for 5 minutes, stand in front of the tree with both hands on it, close your eyes. Starting with the one you rely on the least, begin turning on your senses one at a time, approximately every minute. Focus attention to each sense as you activate it. Maintain attention on the senses previously activated as you do this. This was actually amazing. 5 minutes goes by super fast, and it's really hard to hold in your head all of the information coming in from so many senses at once. You know, influences of this kind of practice range from, you know, Pauline Oliveira's deep listening practice, Fluxus performance scores, nature observation exercises, mindfulness exercises. My partner, Sarah Smith, and I did a project called Cacophony, in which she developed a series of perception exercises. So I'm kind of working in a tradition here. And then the last thing I want to talk about are these durational videos I've been making. So really thinking about time and what it is to be in the forest, the expectations that we have that things will happen at a certain pace. I've made a lot of video out there at this point. I've shot a lot of video. There's a series of video portraits that I've been working on. So I'll give myself an assignment like, today shoot death, on another day shoot color, on another day shoot light, on another day shoot movement, things like that. And through it all, I've made one video that I just finished. This series of photographs are stills from this video, and I shot every week at the same time for a year at the site. So that's what these stills are from. There's another durational video, I haven't edited it yet, but I recently did a shoot where I shot from the tree stand from sunup till sundown. So it was a day, it was 5 in the morning till 9 at night, shooting intermittently throughout the day. I'm gonna just finish with a clip from To Understand a Tree Time, which is the year-long video. And then this goes for a couple of minutes, and then I'll be happy to take any questions. All right. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much, Gina. That's fantastic and stunning. We do already have a couple of questions, so I'm just going to start launching into that. I also have a million questions, but I'll defer as the host. And so first, we had a really nice question from Donald Fortescue. And the question is this. So it's almost as if you have like two periods you have in this project, right? You have the period of observing the tree, knowing and understanding the tree, and then what happens after the tree is felled. So it's like before felling and after felling. This is actually my question. Is that how you, are those the timelines? Is that the timeline in which you view this project happening?
You know, it's a great question. I think it's, you know, it's kind of, that's a very clear, basic, and logical structure, and it definitely applies to the original idea. Yeah, so in that sense, yes, right? On the other hand, is it necessary to cut the tree is another question. So in that sense, no. So I guess that's where I'll leave that.
Okay. So now I'm gonna launch into Donald's question. After you fell the tree, are you thinking about actively replanting, or are you just going to allow the forest to do its own thing? And then he continues with a comment. I wonder about our agency in that regard, especially in places like this, which have been affected by us so often in so many different ways. And I know, Gina, from talking to you, that you've been particularly sensitive to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the sake of time, I didn't go through all the details in terms of how we selected this tree, but ecological considerations were sort of first and foremost in our tree selection process in terms of site, in terms of species, et cetera. In terms of replanting, you know, my collaborator has harvested these acorns and has actually raised seedlings. I don't know that it's actually considered that effective to replant at the same site. It's actually the failure rate for trees in the forest is incredibly high.
Yeah.
Most acorns that even sprout in the forest will never make it to become a full-size mature tree. I think my sense of it is that it makes the most sense to allow the forest to adapt, because there are other trees that are already there that will sort of take the space of that tree. They will have greater access to light, basically, and they will become larger. There's actually a black cherry tree right next to our tree, just about 6 or 8 feet away from it, that would probably benefit if this tree, at least in that way, it would benefit if this tree was gone. One of the things I've really learned, actually, I'm going to quote Kate on this, whose professional work is at the intersection of kind of like botany and horticulture. And she said at one point, when I talk to a gardener about this project, they're very upset about the tree, because gardeners are used to culturing a tree, right? Caring about an individual plant. When I talk to an ecologist or a botanist, they're like, one tree is a paper cut for the forest. So it's really perspectival. And again, it comes back to this issue of scale. If we take one tree out of the forest, it doesn't have necessarily a huge effect. If we come in and we harvest a huge area of forest, of course, that's a different story. So these are the kind of ecological ways of thinking about it. And then, of course, there are other frameworks to think about, which are the sort of, you know, the ethical space of the project, essentially.
Thank you. I wondered this myself, and there have been a couple of, or at least one question about the actual act of felling the tree, and just knowing the collaborations that you've done with choreographers and the way that you've brought the idea of movement into the project, and also your really attuned observations to the life of the forest include the rhythms. And the kind of I don't know, the percussive kind of elements of the forest. What will the felling look like? So what will the actual, will it be ceremonial, or will it just be a typical kind of more observational kind of witnessing of how this is typically done?
That's a really great question, and I really haven't gotten there yet. So immersed in the observation part of this, which I don't even know how to end really. I'm not ready to end that, but I would say there's some ecological concerns and some practical concerns. So according to both of those logics, felling the tree in winter is what makes the most sense. It does the least damage to the ground. Also, there aren't nesting birds and that kind of thing at that time. We also, we have a legal arrangement with Smith College, who very generously, this is a very unconventional request for a visiting artist. And we went through quite a bit of work to arrange for this to be possible. And they were very open-minded and generous in granting this request. So we have to work with the person who fells the tree has to be insured and that kind of thing. So there's some boundaries that have to be respected.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Dave Leader. Are you interested in measuring the growth of the tree, which I think was covered, right, with some specialists who came out and did some measurements, but he's mentioning vertical and circumference. And then an entirely different question, the sounds, what were the sounds that we were hearing, which sort of seemed to intensify in the last video?
Yeah, so in terms of growth, we haven't actually really measured the growth of the tree from last year to this year, though we probably should start taking those measurements. We have another kind of collaborator who is at Smith College. His name's Jimmy Grogan, and he is a botanist there. And he's interested in measuring all the trees around the tree on the site, and he knows how to calculate their growth rates. And then when this tree is felled, or if this tree is felled, continuing to measure their growth rates over subsequent years to see, okay, what really happens here? That's really a really interesting question to us. Will that black cherry tree have a kind of explosion of growth when this oak tree is gone? What will happen with all the other trees around? So those are some growth measurements that we're beginning to kind of develop as a part of this. The sounds, so all those little kind of percussive sounds, that's the mast year. That's the acorns falling in the fall. There's so many of them. It was so noisy out there a lot in the fall. And then other than that, it's wind, it's birds, it's, you can actually hear the Amtrak train goes a few miles from there. You can hear the Amtrak pretty frequently. You hear airplanes, many fewer of them over the last few months, which has been really nice. But there's a lot of sound.
Wow. So when I heard you correctly, that the mast year is not, it's not rhythmic. It doesn't happen cyclically. It's on its own schedule that's hard to map.
I would have to defer to a botanist on that one. But what I've read is 2 to 5 years, and I don't know what signals a tree to produce for a mast year to produce that high production.
That's fascinating. Okay, Suzanne Kahn would like to know how you see your work as an existential question about our personal relevance in the multiple communities to which we belong. Is there an element of traumatic response to not knowing and perhaps privileging a living totem in the hope of finding clarity?
Could you read the second part of that question again?
Mm-hmm. I will read directly how it's written. Is there an element of traumatic response to not knowing and perhaps privileging a living totem in hope of finding clarity?
That's really interesting.
And I guess in terms of reflecting back on a general existential question.
I mean, I guess in response to the first part, which I think you kind of asked was, my feeling is, yes, I am asking that question. I think the existential question. I see myself as asking it, not answering it. Mm-hmm. traumatic response to not knowing is a very interesting phrase that I've never thought of before. So I think I would need some time to sit with that one. You know, Kate and I have had a lot of conversations about not knowing and sitting with uncertainty and with basically unknowability, the unknowability of a tree, which is a kind of, if you read a little further in those I and thou excerpts than I quoted, he kind of gets to that ultimately, you know, one sits with the tree itself, and you can apply all of these frameworks to the tree, and ultimately you can't ever really know the tree. And I think that in a way that's part of what the durational videos have given me a way to contemplate. Like maybe I'm just a person who needs something to do. So I need to make this video that allows me to just sort of be in that space of not knowing with the tree. But I do think that that is ultimately the answer, that, you know, we can know a tree in a lot of different ways, but a tree is ultimately a very different life form from us. We can't totally know it. And then we have to make decisions about how we live in relation to it. Anyway.
Well, I think that's, I mean, I think in my notes that I was taking as while you were speaking, I think I wrote the word existential question about 15 times. I mean, it's impossible to do what you're doing and not consider those kind of basic human questions. Who are we? What are we doing here? And what are we doing here in relationship to these other beings that we share this space with? All right, so it is that kind of, I mean, the essence of this inquiry is really about why are we here in a way.
Yeah, and I think you know, honestly, like my primary motivation was just on a personal level to stop dodging the question.
And wasn't the original title of this project To Know a Tree? No, it was always To Understand a Tree, but I think there's an important distinction there between to know something and to understand it.
I'm not even sure this is the right title.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, titles are hard.
So important note, asterisk working title.
Yeah.
So there's a question about, from Christopher Loomis, I'm particularly interested in the intuitive or non-scientific part of your talk. What other references can you make regarding this question, ranging from decolonialism to Indigenous people? And I have to admit that I also had this question raised because I considered, you know, forestry practices of Indigenous people that were here in the Americas, or what we call the Americas now, that precede very contemporary forestry management practices that are sort of just being discovered, quote unquote, now.
Right, right. I mean, I think my honest answer to that is I think I have more work to do in that regard. You know, this has been a really like emergent process, and we've sort of worked initially with the people who are sort of close at hand and who have sort of come forward. And I think, you know, Joe Kent Katz was amazing in terms of just sort of coming forward and volunteering to be involved with this. And I was like, wow, that's like a whole different lens that I wouldn't have had otherwise. In terms of the decolonization, as you say, the relationship to Indigenous forest practices, I think there are a lot of people that we would love to get to talk with us more. And we haven't done as much outreach as I think we will do. And so I think that there's more of that to come.
Well, I mean, depending on when you plan, I don't know if you've landed on the date at which you're going to actually fell the tree. You mentioned that you've honed in on a season, but not necessarily a date. So is it going to be this winter? Is it going to be next winter? I mean, to keep in mind that this is actually a work in progress.
I've pushed myself really hard not to apply any production frameworks to this project. It's a really cognitively kind of overwhelming project in many ways because there's so many parts to it, and there's so many questions about like, where do you stop and all these things. And being somebody who has done a lot of production in my life, I'm really, you know, pushing myself to not do that and to let these things unfold, because it's really, I think we have to get it right, and it might take a really long time, and I think that might be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. the from JVD. The botanist Robin Wall-Kimmerer has advocated for giving plant life different pronouns rather than it, rather than the ungendered it, based on indigenous language around plant and animal life. As you get to know this tree, do you feel a need to name it and to offer a pronoun other than the general neutered it?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I don't feel the need to pronoun the tree or to name the tree at all. When Joe was communicating with the trees, apparently the trees had a critique of pronouns. They felt that the pronouns did not adequately apply to trees and really not to humans either. So I feel I didn't feel a responsibility to pronoun the trees, but I feel even less of one now. It's funny, I have a good friend who's a woodworker who I've been friends with for a couple of decades. And when I first told him about this project last year, the first thing he said is, "Do not name the tree." So, yeah.
Is that like livestock producers?
I think that was the basic idea, yeah.
Don't get that, don't get connected through the naming.
Don't cultivate attachments for your audience and then traumatize them. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or for yourself. Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent segue to the next question, which is how, and I think you and I have talked about this earlier as well, how are you going to feel about cutting down the tree with all the intimacy that you continue to foster with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the central question, right? Like, I think that, that the I and thou excerpt really neatly kind of captures that in the sense of, if you can maintain an it relationship to the tree, then you can kind of say like, hey, it's a paper cut for the forest, right? And if the tree becomes you, it's harder. And I think that for me, one of the tricky parts of this has been that I was keeping a distance from it in a way for a long time because I was like, okay, we're going to cut this tree down. And then I was like, but if I keep a distance from the tree, then I'm failing to even ask the question that the whole project exists to ask. So I have to not do that. And so I've had to kind of just starting it, and I think this happened because of the pandemic, indirectly. I had to take a step back from that decision and say, I'm just not deciding that right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important, especially in order to guard the kind of data and knowledge sets that you're creating and then collecting through the course of this project, and then not to put any sort of precepts on the work that you do with it, with the material after it's felled as well.
Yeah.
Let's see. David Markowitz is asking, do you have any are you planning any, or have you done any examination of the subsurface?
We would like to bring a geologist in to talk to us about soil. Neither of us has expertise in that. And one of the things about this is like, there was a period early on when I realized if we were going to really ask this question scientifically, I would have to go to school for like 30 years before I could do the project. And was like, well, that's not possible. So how do we do this? So some of it is about saying like, okay, we don't need to study everything. We want to look at certain things. And so we're kind of pinpointing certain things that make the most sense to us to look at, choosing the level of investigation, choosing the level of detail that we can go to, and then bringing in some people to fill in some of those gaps. But it's definitely become clear that it is not possible for us to know everything that is possible to be known in the empirical sense about this tree, nor will that produce the insight that is actually at the core of the question.
There's a question from Trisha Peck. Can you share what your greatest surprise has been from this project so far? And for example, have you shifted course in your project because of something new that you've learned or observed?
That's a great question. Hi, Trisha. So, greatest surprise. That information isn't the answer, I think.
So, okay. unpack that, please.
Well, I don't know. I'm awfully empirical for an artist, and I think that I mean, I come from like a sciencey family, right? And so it's like, it seems like information should, you know, that's what you do. You have a question, you figure out how to ask it in a way that can be answered, and then you go answer it with information. Well, this isn't an information question. You know, I love this distinction. My partner's a research librarian, and she talks about researchable questions versus answerable questions. And I think about that all the time. And I think I'm basically asking a question that isn't really answerable purely through information, though information is part of it. So I guess that's the surprise. I will also say that I think the pandemic has changed this project in ways that I don't totally understand yet. Part of it is that I've got to spend more time out there. And that was amazing. And it's very quiet there post-pandemic, except for the socially distant hikers who talk really loud. But there's something also about the gesture, like killing something as an artistic gesture changed as soon as 150,000 people died of this disease, right? It just changed. And I don't know, I can't unpack that yet, but I know that it's there. It's just changing things.
Yeah, so it's definitely impacting your sense of scale. And then I would imagine extrapolating from that also your sense of how humanity interacts with the natural world.
Yeah, and I think everything is just changing really rapidly right now, and it's really just, yeah, I'm just trying to stay open.
That's great. Claire Ober is asking, she's curious as to other ecological measurements in terms of the transient experience of the tree, such as passing weather patterns, seasonal temperatures, and so on, possibly, but not necessarily climate-related events. And that's actually a really good question, and I'm not sure that was touched on. And I'm not sure also the time frame that we're talking about really offers you the chance to do that, but I defer to you.
To understand the tree in relation to climate change, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, climate change is, I feel like climate change is the real, in a way, the real topic of the project in some regards, because climate change is also the existential question that's hovering over us all the time. You know, so factually speaking, my understanding is that red oak as a species is fairly well situated to adapt to climate change. It's a species that's a so-called generalist species, so it grows in a lot of different environments. It has a big geographic range. It's very pretty healthy and well represented regionally here. So it's not seen as a super sensitive species. Many species in the forest that we're in right now are suffering with a lot of different forest pathogens. I won't go into all of that, but that's been a big learning curve for me in this, is like you go out in the woods and it's like a beautiful day and everything looks all beautiful and wonderful. And then you realize like those are dying, those are sick, those are struggling, down the line. And it's been a really big eye-opening experience for me, both as a person who is engaged with nature and also as a woodworker. So I think the red oak trees are well situated in terms of climate change. I think Bob Leverett's research has been one piece of information that has changed how I think about cutting this tree, actually. To know that the big trees have a bigger impact on mitigating climate change than is conventionally thought. And so that changes, I think, ideas about what is appropriate to harvest for a given purpose. Our tree is not by any means the biggest tree in the forest, but it's on, you know, it's a mature tree. It's a 75-ish-year-old tree. So those are some beginning thoughts about climate change. I don't think that covers it. I think there's more work to be done in really thinking about how we want to relate to that aspect.
That's a great answer. We have from Egan Ofner, did the intuitive you worked with speak to the tree's response to being a part of this project?
Yeah, quite a bit, in fact. In her experience, the trees have been predicting this time for a long time, that they are prepared for all that is coming. They're better prepared for it than we are. And it was kind of seen as inconsequential whether the tree was cut by me or not. The trees in Joe's experience with them feel that woodworkers' work honors trees in a genuine way. That was a nice thing to hear, and to be totally honest, a little surprising, because I question it quite a bit. Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, Scott Brown. Hi, Scott. He says that he keeps thinking of the parallels to human relationships and the ways in which we choose one being over others, and spending years seeking to know that one being completely, I'm not sure if I read that right. The ways that we choose one being over others, and then we spend years seeking how to know that one being completely, including how they relate to their own environment. How does this project affecting or altering your human relationships? Ooh, that's a good one.
How is this project affecting my human relationships? Well, hi, Scott. Thanks for that question. Yeah, well, so, you know, I've gotten to meet a lot of wonderful people through it, first of all. You know, to play on the networked idea of forests and Suzanne Simard's research, like I feel like, you know, and there's offshoot project happening from this, and, you know, getting to really, I think really one of the privileges of being an artist for me in the way that I work at this point is that I can kind of like ask people questions and they'll take the time to answer them.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I've been finding is that, like, talking to people who are foresters or ecologists or in relation to all these kind of practices, like, people really want to get the word out about what they're doing and what they know. And it's really hard to connect out in certain cases. And so they do a tremendous amount of work to get the word out. And I think that something that artists can do is actually get the word out in a different way, with a different framework, in a way that's maybe more holistic in certain cases, and that can impact people. I had a conversation early on with Paul Wetzel, who's the field station manager and is a restoration ecologist, and he was explaining to me why he supported the project, because he's a really important supporter of it. And he said, you know, scientists are doing amazing stuff. They're writing all these papers out there, and they get peer reviewed and they get published in these journals, and that's all great. But then they don't get read by the people who really need to read them in a lot of cases, because they stay within the kind of compartmentalized realm of their discipline of science. And, you know, this is a project, like, I'm not an expert in forests. I'm not an expert in woodworking. I'm not an expert in really anything, but I'm able to ask a question and bring it to a group of people. And I think that that's really the role. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I think that networked relationships is really how I'm thinking of it. In terms of closer personal relationships, I think maybe people are maybe a little bit tired of me talking so much about this project, but yeah, I'll stop there.
So what I'm hearing is that the potential for collaboration is rather an organic potential, meaning that it can be kind of interrogative project that involves the voices of many and the expertises of many, which going back to your sort of humble claim about being an artist and not a botanist or a researcher or a scientist, I think that's something that artists uniquely offer, is this maybe more inclusive willingness to collect viewpoints and then interpret them in some way.
I mean, I think optimistically speaking, that's my stance and that's my hope. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to find exactly the right balance of people or exactly the right partners. But yeah, and that's why we're just giving this time.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Gina, and thank you so much for everybody for joining us tonight. And we went a little over time, but I hope that's okay with you, Gina, because there were a lot of questions that came up tonight. So I know a lot of people will be following the course of this project, and however you choose to let people in and be part of it. I do want to note that on the Woodshed, we have Suzanne Simard's podcast that she did with Radiolab, which is fascinating. I've listened to it several times. I can't get enough of it. So do check out the Woodshed, which is the center's kind of activity portal site or microsite for that. And then the recording of Gina's talk is going to also be hosted on the Woodshed, so continue to check in. In the meantime, thank you so much for being a part of this lecture to understand a tree tonight. If you are enjoying the programming that the Center for Art and Wood is producing in this time of kind of being stuck in our homes still, don't be shy to kick over a little donation. We would certainly very much appreciate it, and I know that the artists with whom we're working would definitely appreciate it as well. We're so thrilled to be able to do this and to host these conversations, and I know I'm learning a lot, and I hope you are as well. So please continue to check back in. And the only other thing that I want to say right now is, Gina, thank you so much for who you are and your intellect and your inquiries, and I can't wait to see where this goes. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nava, and thanks to everybody. I also just want to say, you know, this project, it is a kind of open-ended thing in a lot of ways, and if anybody's really interested in continuing to be in conversation about it, or you know, feel free to reach out to me through my website or social media or through the Center for Art and Wood.
Yeah, well, there was a question just about that, so we'll continue to check in with you in the course of your investigation and keep people informed. So be safe, everyone. Have a very lovely evening, and keep in touch.